Well, we're excited to have another month and another webinar. So I'd like to welcome everyone out there in the audience who's listening to our webinar today. My name is Abby Bauer, and I am an associate editor for Hoards Dairyman magazine. And once again, I want to thank you for taking the time to be a part of this presentation. I am fortunate to have Mike Hutchins from the University of Illinois to be my co-host today. And then together we have the pleasure of welcoming Larry Tranel from Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. He will be giving a presentation titled Economics and User Experiences with Automatic Milking. The webinar for this month is sponsored by Cargill Animal Nutrition. You can see their logo there on the slide. We're very pleased to have their support of this program. I'd also like to give a shout out to some of our other team members, Jim Baltz at the University of Illinois, and our Hoards Dairyman online media manager, Patty Hirchin, who do all the behind the scenes work to make sure everything runs smoothly for these monthly webinars. For those of you that are live, if you want to get yourself a copy of the handouts, the presentation slides that Larry will be working from, you can go over to the webinar control panel, go down most of the way, and you'll see a section that says handouts. And right there, you can click on those links and get PDFs that you could print out if you want to have the slides to refer to later on. Also, if there's anyone in the audience that has a question that comes up while you're listening to the presentation, you can go into the questions section and type that question in. And then as moderators, we can see the questions and we will share them with the presenter who will answer them at the end of the presentation. I think, Mike, we're ready now. If you would do the introductions for Larry and help us kick off the presentation for this month.
Well, thank you very much, Abby. It's my personal and professional pleasure to introduce a good co-worker from the four-state area here, Dr. Larry Tranel. Larry grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin, graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, and then spent 10 years as a dairy farm management agent in the University of Wisconsin. For the last 20 years, he has been with Iowa State University in their extension program as a dairy specialist. Larry works in a number of broad areas, but certainly in the area of milking systems, housing systems, organic and grazing dairy farms as well. She's a frequent contributor to Hoards Dairyman and speaks around the world on the various topics that he's studied and worked with as well. And he's received several prestigious awards. So Larry, with that introduction, we'll turn the program over to you and let you discuss our topic here today, looking at automatic milking systems.
All right, appreciate that, Mike. So as we take a look at both the economics and also some user experiences of robotic milking, I always like to introduce, this is the first robotic milkers that went into the state of Iowa, Mark and Sandra Earhart, the late Sandra. I actually like to dedicate these presentations to her, but they shared with me just so much enthusiasm and knowledge of robotic milking systems, which actually kind of got me into robotics in the first place. When we talk about robotic milking, I always like to say I've been on 1,500 farms in my dairy career in the last 30 years. And I've never been on two farms that are alike, and I've never met two dairy farmers that are exactly alike either. So when we take a look at adapting this technology onto farms, it's so unique for each and every individual, every farm that we work with, that it's important that we just really keep that in mind, is that this experience is different for everybody. We also look at family, culture, and just personal preferences, quality of life things that really play a part in this system. And I like this picture here just because of labor availability. And what does labor cost you? Is it a means for kids to learn a responsibility, or does it have a big financial cash cost where you're paying your labor? And so I think that really kind of plays a part into the milking systems that we might choose for our farms. When we take a look at what's the best way to milk me, are robots the best way? I like this quote from Ben Freund, who I just listened to a couple weeks ago out in Connecticut. And one of the thoughts I really agree with him is that robots really help us unleash cow constraints. There are so many things that we do to dairy cows in our facilities that inhibit cows to exhibit their full potential in milk production. And I think one of the big benefits of robots is undoubtedly that ability to kind of unleash some of that potential. It also magnifies labor. So we take a look at how important labor efficiency is to these operations. And I think as we've seen the advent of robots, it's really given us a different perspective what that labor is all about and what that labor can actually do. A third one that I really like is that robots, yeah, they are a tool. But if we're on farms that have some, whether it be production problems, management problems, financial problems, that these robots definitely are not a solution to those problems, or a tool to help us maybe overcome a bit of that or better manage it. But if we've got a lot of problems, I think robots seem like they tend to succeed the best when it's a successful farm to begin with. And then we look at robots being a big financial cost, a big investment, because in a sense, we're actually buying 15 years worth of labor, and we've got to pay for it sometimes in 7, 10 years or whatever the life of the loan is. But it's a big investment up front, and just to take a look at what the long-term cost of milking labor might be for a particular farm. So what's the best way to milk me? Good extension answer, it depends, and we'll go through what it all depends on. This is a Wisconsin modernization study that was done some years ago. And if we take a look at the blue lines, or the blue bars being some of the pre-modernization milking system throughput versus the gold, which is the post-modernization throughput. When we take a look at robotic milking systems, one of my biggest pet peeves is, why aren't all these milking systems up in this range here where the red box is? So for us, even some very simple milking systems that can get 60, 64 cows per person per hour, to me should be a minimum nowadays. But we still have a lot of milking systems that are even built brand new that still don't have the labor efficiencies that we think they should have. So again, when we compare a robot, again, what are we comparing it to? And hopefully we're comparing it to a system that we could possibly build that might be in this range here. So to magnify the value of the labor, I always like to tell young producers especially, labor is what you tend to have to sell, especially as a young person that might not have a lot of assets. So why invest extra time every day doing a needless activity where your milking system might not be quite as efficient as it should be? So on the left side here, we'll tend to see cows milk per person per hour. So this was the average in that Wisconsin study. After modernization, they got up to here, but I tend to say they should be up in this range here. So you can see the differences in milk, pounds of milk per hour, and what that dollar cost on a per day basis is, or dollar per hundredweight when labor is at, say, 12, and here it's at $15. Now we're going to compare some of those systems to a robot, and let's say at 4,500 pounds a day over 60 cows, where we get that labor bill down to 28 cents. And so again, it really magnifies this labor. We take a look at some of the conventional systems that, trying to get 1.2 million pounds of milk per FTE or per full-time worker. And we take a look at some robotic systems where we're really reducing that labor and maybe getting up to 2.2 million pounds. But if we could really think of one person milking 120 cows with 4,500 pounds per robot on 2 robots, we could start thinking of some labor efficiencies of 3.2 million pounds of milk per year for maybe a kind of a buy feed system where basically what they're doing is really managing the robots. So again, these robots can really magnify the value of labor if we put our mind to it, and I think we're just starting to kind of see that. So as we compare a robot to, say, another type of milking system, I just want to take a little bit of time and actually go through the tool that I tend to use working through this. So the first one is kind of take a look at some old car versus a truck and what it might cost per mile to drive it. So the process is the same. We're looking at depreciation, interest, repairs, taxes, and insurance, which are what I call the DIRTI 5 tool. And plus, we'll take a look at variables. So with these vehicles, gas might be a variable and a few other things as well. And then we'll apply that tool to the robots. So just in a real quick sense, if we buy this nice truck here at $40,000, and 20 years later, or 5 years later, it's worth $20,000, we've got about $4,000 worth of depreciation, versus this car that was bought for $2,200, $2,200. By the time we sell it, it's still worth $1,000. Divide that by 5 years, that's $240 per year with depreciation. The interest at 5.5%, you can see the $2,200 versus $121 a year. The repairs at $1,000 a year. Taxes when you purchase something. When you look at the insurance of what it might cost. So as we summarize this up on this fixed cost of this versus this, we're looking at 43 cents a mile in fixed cost to drive this thing versus 9 cents a mile to drive this thing. So again, robots versus some other type of milking parlor are going to be the same thought process. With gas at $3 a gallon, that adds another 20 cents a mile to this one, or 12 cents a mile to this one because it gets better gas mileage. But the bottom line is when we take a look at trying to compare two types of investments, again, whether it's robots or low-cost parlors or different types of tractors, or what I've got up here, is that the difference right here, I can break it down on per hour of driving, is that it costs me $26 more per hour to drive this thing than it does this thing, which people have a hard time believing, but that's actually kind of how the numbers show up. So let's take that same process and compare it to these robots. So we're taking a look at two robots in a system that was retrofitted or remodeled compared to a Swing 12 low-cost parlor. The $400,000, and then one of the big questions is what's this going to be worth afterwards? We'll talk about that a little bit more. Over 15 years, we're looking at a $22,000 worth of depreciation that we've got to pay on this thing each and every year versus a low-cost parlor that might be only $2,200 or about a tenth of that. The interest at 5.5% on both of them. You can see again, this is a tenth of what this might cost. The repairs tends to be one of the biggest confusing and kind of debatable type factors that we see, but our data shows that about $8,000 per year per robot. So here we've got two, so $16,000 a year versus this parlor that might only have $1,000 of repair. So no taxes on agriculture equipment here in Iowa. Insurance, as we insure these things, you can see as we sum this up on fixed costs alone, $1.88 per hundredweight for these two robots. And with this, it might be, it's only 20 cents a hundredweight of fixed costs. But again, we have high labor costs in here at 5 hours, over $15 an hour. So for 88 cents being added into here, we can actually total this up. And this isn't a total cost because I didn't put all these variable costs in here. But for $1.08 for most of the fixed costs and the labor versus $2.13 a hundredweight for this robot. But I think the important part of this slide is actually down here. Again, what are we comparing it to? Because we could compare this to two robots that might only be getting 3,000 pounds of milk out of a per robot, and we could be comparing it to a low-cost milking parlor that might be getting 75 to 80 cows. So very high efficiency here, very low efficiency here. I can guarantee that this is going to be more profitable. But when we take a look at a robotic milking system that might be getting 6,000 pounds of milk per robot per day, that's comparing to a milking system that's 22 cows per person per hour, 44 cows per person per hour, then we can guarantee that the robot's going to be more profitable. So again, the key is what we're going to try to compare it to. So if this is our robotic milking system, the first one that was built back in 1981 in Holland, when we take a look at what that is to what it's evolved to today. So right now we have somewhere between 150 to 160 robots milking on about 55 to 57 farms here in Iowa. So we have about 5% of our dairies here in Iowa that are milking with robots. I know Canada's probably got about 10 or 11% of their dairies that are milking with robots. The rotary robots have come in as well. And so again, I put this picture here with this Dairy Pro Q because I was actually in one of these parlors and actually watched a person milk 400 cows per person per hour in this kind of a system. So again, these robots can help magnify labor, which is pretty important in the dairy industry. When we get asked the question about, do robots pay? My question is, well, what are you thinking about? Are you thinking about cash flow? Are you thinking about profitability? Are you thinking about the profit it might have to your family life, quality of life, or whatever? So depending on how we take a look at it, I've seen robots that are just, say, 2 or 3 robots in a farm that might be negative 50,000 up to a positive 20,000 on the cash flow. So typically the cash flow actually goes a little bit negative. The profit or the net financial impact could be negative, it could be positive. When people are asked about their quality of life, that tends to be a pretty positive thing, but not always. But so again, cash flow ability, profitability, quality of life, just on 2 or 3 robots, this could be a negative 50,000, it could be a positive 50,000, again, depending on the system. This is a very busy slide that I apologize for, but I'll just go through real quickly. We're looking at 2 milkings a day in a stall barn, a low-cost parlor, a high-cost parlor, a robot, and here's a double 8 that was running for 22 hours a day, and looking at the difference of just what it costs. And so this is kind of looking at the fixed costs, the DIRTI 5 that we just went through, along with the labor analysis. And basically, the bottom line of it is that it shows that the stall barns actually can be, even if you give me the stall barns can be a very expensive way to milk cows. And as a percent of the milk check, it might be up to 12% of the milk check. When people are getting paid $20 and $24 a hundredweight, to be able to spend $2 or $3 a hundredweight, maybe not quite as a big deal. But as milk prices hover around $15 and $16 a hundredweight, to spend that extra $1 or $2 a hundredweight just for milking your cows tends to be a bigger deal. This robot here at cost per hundredweight of $2.33. I'm going to go through a couple different analyses because we see a lot of variation in this cost. And so whether it's $1.77 a hundredweight, we've seen it up to this high, but again, it really depends on how efficient that robot's being managed. But again, how much of that milk price is actually being paid to milk the cows. This double 8 milking 22 hours a day on 660 cows, you can see their cost per hundredweight well under $1 a hundredweight, 5% of the milk price. And so people would ask the question, would this producer here ever put in a robot if you've got that kind of efficiency and that kind of a low cost? And 99.9% of people would tend to say, well, no, why would they do that? But this producer actually is milking with about 10 robots right now here in the state of Iowa that just got installed. Okay, so there's a lot of other things besides money and the financials that we're going to try to cover today that are important as people install these robots. As we take a look at this slide, again, I apologize for another busy slide here, but as we take a look at the red being the labor cost and the green being the capital cost. Okay, so even if you gave me the stall barn, I have no capital cost in this whatsoever. Still, that labor can actually get this. It's $1.25 here, but I've seen it into the $1.50, even $1.75 or so of labor costs going into these tie stall barns. When we take a look at some of the low-cost parlors, if we can milk our cows for less than $1 a day, I tend to say that's probably a pretty a good system. We can compete with just about any dairy in the rest of the world at that rate. We've got milking systems. Sometimes they're getting into that $2.13 here. We've seen some of these up to even to $3 because even here our robot range $1.77. Again, it could get pretty competitive to a tie stall barn, or even up to $3, but at $3 it's not very competitive to most other systems. When we take a look at just the annual investment cost, 15-year life versus a 10-year life, and we probably don't use much with the 10-year life anymore from a study we did back in 2012, but just the investment cost of $336 a cow or $1.42 a hundredweight. When we take a look at the labor cost on top of that on a 15-year life, at $1.77 a hundredweight. So again, we can get those costs into a very competitive range as we take a look at the robots. So our first poll, Mike, you're going to ask the question?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and ask the questions here. Get ready to vote. And the question, are robots higher or lower cost than milking in a parlor? And so now, based on what you've heard here, you have 5 choices. Higher, second choice, lower. And number 3 depends on the system being compared. Number 4 depends on the variable like a milk price and a production response. Could be all of the above. Oh boy, Abby, here we go. You're really going to test you today. The polls are open and we've got about half the people in. Abby, do you want to, how are you going to vote on this one?
Good question. You know, I think I would pick the answer that higher. Just thinking of that initial investment in the robots, I believe there could be variability, but knowing that that's a big cost up front, I think my choice will be the first option, higher. What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I'm kind of stuck here a little because I think I listened to Larry. It looks like it could be higher or lower. So now I look like I got 2 choices. So I'm going to go to the bottom one. I'm going to go all of the above at this point, going back to my college days. And Jim, we got and Larry, we got 77% of the vote in. So let's share that. And Larry, what do you think of the answers you got here?
Well, I think they're actually very probable, the answers that I got that I expected to get, because 21% said that they would be higher, and the tendency is that they would be higher. We only had 1% that said that they would be lower, but I would actually say that we've got some operations in here that we can actually prove that their costs were actually lower by the time they actually got done. But again, it depends on what system, which is number 3, it's being compared to, which 22% picked up on that. 10% said it depends on variables like milk price and production response, and those are about probably the 2 biggest variables that come into play as in a sensitivity analysis with these robots. And then just under 50% said that it could be all of above. And so I would tend to say that all these answers could have been right. And so that could be all the above would probably be the most appropriate answer, but I can't say anybody would actually be wrong in that. So appreciate the response to that. So now we're going to move into some of the management practices of the robotic milking systems. We did this survey back in 2012. We also did it in 2017. You can tell that our dairy industry really, it really sits up here in Northeast Iowa and actually in Northwest Iowa a little bit. Then we got little parts of the dairy industry in Iowa, all over the state, but down in this area as well. And so when we take a look at this survey, we surveyed 15 farms. They had 41 robots. So we had a lot of farms that just had one or two. The average was about 2.8 robots per farm. They were all either Lely, DeLaval, or Galaxy brand. 60 cows per robot, an average herd size of about 200. And so, but that's very typical of the dairy industry that we have here in Northeast Iowa. The cows per employee is always kind of interesting. So before the installation, they had 46 cows per employee. You can see what the range was. And after the installation, they actually averaged about 80 cows per employee, and really, again, magnified the value of that labor and that what labor can actually be with this. You can see that 86% were free flow, 7% guided flow, and 7% partially guided flow. And this would probably be at that, I know, high percentage of being Lely's, which are free flow is very highly promoted by the Lely's brand, so that's probably impacting that as well. So when we take a look at, if we would ask another question, what's the biggest reason? Just labor, labor, labor. Whether it's availability, flexibility, the cost of labor. Labor undoubtedly is the number one reasons people go to robotics. If we look at 2012, before in our milking systems, and again, these milking systems beforehand were probably not the most efficient, but they went from 15.6 hours of labor down to 3.9, about a 75% decrease, plus they added 12% more cows. In 2017, they went from 10.1 to 5.6. We reduced the labor 45%, but we added 33% more cows. Again, we are magnifying labor. We can't harp on that enough. When we look at milk production and quality changes, the milk production increase of 10 to 17%. I do want to speak about this one a little bit, because if you go to a robot and look at a lot of the data, I can almost guarantee you 3 to 5%, you're going to be doing something wrong if you don't get a 3 to 5% increase if you're going from 2x to robotic milking. If you're going from 3x to robotic milking, you may actually see a decrease a little bit. But if you're going from 2x, we would tend to say that we can almost guarantee a 3 to 5% increase, and the research bears that out. But if you're building something new, a new freestall barn, even robot aside, I would tend to almost guarantee you somewhere like 6 to 8% milk production increase, just going from an older freestall barn or stall barn into a brand new freestall barn that's just very up to date, and cow comfort is very well done. So that milk production increase tends to be a little bit higher than I think around the country and around the world. But maybe it's because of extension, Mike, or whatever that we have here in Iowa, that this increases so much, a little bit more than we see the rest of it. But when you take a look at that, milk production is one of the big variables, and we also mentioned milk price as well being a big variable of the economics of that. So going from before and after, the percent fat and protein, realize we should be getting a little bit of an increase in both milk production, I guess all three, fat and protein, just based on genetics from one year to the next. So take that into account as well. Somatic cell counts tend to decrease. Early on, they might go up a little bit as you're getting used to the robot, but they tend to decrease about 3 to 5% afterwards. How were cows milked prior to it? So you see a lot of parallel parlors here, is 20% tie stall barn, herringbone, parabone parlor, step-up parlor. But again, how were they milked prior to is a big bearing to whether this is going to be more profitable than the previous system or not. AMS installation, about 53% were new build, 46% in the retrofit or remodel type mode. But again, if we're going to be building new, I would almost guarantee 6 to 8% increased milk production just by building the new facility, whether or not you put a robot on top of it. Okay, in a retrofit facility, if it's just basically staying the same, and then you put a robot onto it, then we'd be looking more towards that 3 to 5%. But I say that, but then also realize that we've had some examples here in Iowa with some retrofits, and all they did pretty much was put the robot in and some of the management style that went with it, and we could see some 25, even 30% increases on some farms. And so the milk production increase is it's all over the board on these farms. This is a video that I like to show. So are they more profitable compared to what? So one of the best parlors that we have in Iowa is this Trans Iowa low-cost milking parlor. One person milks and swing 15 all by themselves. And when we take a look at prepping 5, milking 5, and they're going to swap it over, so you can see with the 15 units, very seldom are more than 3 or 4 of these units, but sitting there by themselves. So when we take a look at that comparison, is one thing we do in a lot of our parlors is that we train cows not to come into milking parlors. And so you can see he's actually got his hand on the crowd gate coming in here to bring these cows in. And so most people want to fill this line up and then shut the gate and make those cows work on the person's time frame, not the cow's time frame. So again, that training of cows to not want to come into these parlors. And so I think there's a lot of efficiencies that can be picked up in a lot of these milking parlors. And if we can pick up that efficiency, it would actually change this thought process. Again, what's more profitable, the parlor or the robotic milking system? So when we take a look at this whole concept, can one person milk 75 cows per person by themselves without having to work that hard? I didn't appreciate being a Packer fan that he wore this Moss jersey as we did that, but that's really the thought process, is what are we comparing this to? Okay, so this is another one that this is actually a dairy producer in Wisconsin that was planning on putting in a robotic rotary milking system into it. And so because of funds or whatever, they decided to put something low cost, the Tranel low cost parlor in here, but with the rapid exits and a few things like that. But just when you take a look at whatever system people work with, is it efficient? Is it safe and comfortable for cow or milkers? Does it fit the family goals? And the bottom line, why I like to show this picture, is that once they really developed a nice milking system there, is that one of their last comments to me is they can't see themselves putting the robots in anymore because they put such a nice parlor. It was actually not that expensive to put this in either. So from the farmer's perspective, the main reasons for installing AMS is basically labor, quality of life, which is a labor thing, the cost of labor, which is another thing. So again, labor. Other reasons, the next generation, education, milk production, cow management, modernizing their facilities, all came from the survey as well. The key factors for robot success, just the daily and routine maintenance. Okay, so when we take a look at these repair bills, sometimes being in that $8,000 per robot on average, but it ranges from a low of about $3,000 per robot up to about $16,000 a year on these robots. And so that daily routine and maintenance and what you can fix yourself is really important to the success of this. And we've had some robots that have been torn out because the maintenance cost, they just figured they couldn't handle these maintenance costs over the next 10, 15 years if they're going to be that much early on. So nutrition, basically I'm not a nutritionist. There's always a lot of nutrition questions that come into this, but the pellet tends to be pretty important, and it doesn't even have to be a pellet because we've got some herds here in Iowa that are going actually away from the pellets because of cost and things like that, and still seeing some very good success without losing much, hardly at all with them. And so that nutrition factor, just to get a handle on that, is probably the biggest key. Once we get the maintenance, probably the next biggest key to really having the success with that. So a good nutritionist that's working with that. So healthy cows and good barn flow, that barn design is just huge. And so every time we take a look at these barn designs and try to put a robot on, just things like boss cows and the ability of the cows to be close to the robot, not having too big of a different types of places where cows are going to huddle around the robot and things like that because they need access. And then cows that can walk are definitely pretty important. And then utilizing the records and the data, it's just farmers are just amazed at how many data points they get for each cow every day that they can take a look at and try to better manage their herd. 100% of the people that were surveyed, this is both in 2012 and 17, would say that it's a good financial investment, it's a good personal investment, it's a good management investment, taking a lot better care of the cows and things like that, a good overall investment. And even though it was 100%, realize we did not survey those who have sold their robots because of a frustration with this, that, and especially repair costs, or just didn't feel like it was in their best long-term interest to stick with the robot. I like to show this slide because this is kind of a thought process. When we look at putting in a robot, I always have to ask producers, where are you at in your dairy career? So if you've only got, say, 7 or 9, maybe even 10 years left in your dairy career, it might be kind of questionable if you're going to be investing in this. This dairy producer in Spain was looking at these robots, and these are some earlier robots, and he was basically saying it was about $20,000 to $25,000 US per year to try to repair these robots after about 13 years. And so his wish is that he just wished he would have put the parlor in at that stage in time, because now he wouldn't be faced with this decision again to make that major investment again. So that kind of plays in, just if you're looking at 15 years left in your dairy career, it might be the thing to do as a way to finalize the last few years of your career. So, but just again, where you're at is a pretty important piece of that. So now, Mike, we're going to turn it back over to you here for this question.
Well, get ready to vote here, participants. We have a great turnout. Well, the biggest reason producers tend to go to the robots include, and you have 4 choices here: not having to get up in the morning, saving on feed costs. Number 3, increase in milk production. Number 4, labor. So 4 choices there, Abby. I've got mine figured out. Have you picked yours yet?
I do. I think the farms that I've talked to, I think labor is that big driving problem on a lot of farms. And I would think a motivating force behind looking into automatic milking systems, the increase in milk production would certainly be a bonus for those farms. But I think labor would be the driving factor.
Well, we've got 80% of the vote in, so let's go ahead and share it and let Larry make a comment on the votes.
Okay, well, if it was me, just not having to get up in the morning would have been my answer. But saving a feed cost, we do have a few producers that actually would save a little feed cost, but for the most part, it actually works the other way. The increase in milk production, some people would go after that, but I would definitely agree with 94% of you that said labor. I would tend to say that's probably the most correct, but realize that all these answers, there's not a right or wrong. It's just that some are more correct than others. So as we move on, we're going to now go into this a partial budget, which is available online, that people can go to our website and actually grab this spreadsheet that we put together back in 2011 to help our producers kind of work through these variables. And so let's start working through there. So when we take a look at herd size as a variable, it's is this a small farm technology? I think we've got a lot of farmers out there that are really starting to take a look, say that larger farms can definitely benefit from this as well. But early on, it's been a lot of our small 1, 2, 3, and 4 robot type systems that have kind of worked with this. But we're looking at 3 robots here to compare what I was milking in before to trying to put 3 robots in my system. So the mailbox milk price, sad to say, that's a little higher that I've got in the budget right now than what we're currently getting. But the higher the milk price, the better propensity to put in a robot. Okay, just because that increased milk production and the milk price is going to pay some dividends there. The estimated cost per robot. So I've got about $250,000. This is coming from our survey. So as we work with the dealers, they'll tend to say that a robot's going to cost $185,000, $190,000, maybe up to $220,000, depending on the type. But when we take a look at including the housing and some of those things, what producers are actually spending is at $225,000 to $250,000 for a robot. And so I tend to feel that that's the cost that we need to work with, because that's what they tend to be spending. The estimated annual change in milking system repair, I'll tend to say around $7,000, maybe $8,000. But again, realize what I said before is that we've got some that are only $3,000 per robot, and we've got some that are $16,000 of repairs per robot per year. And that's not including soaps, teat dips, or whatever. That's just including the repair on the robot. So this, the reason it's in yellow, because it is highly variable of what they're spending here, and it's a very major factor of the success of this robot as well. So 3 robots needed, the years of useful life. Earlier we were saying about 10 to 13 years here. Now we're tending to say about 15 years. Some of the producers are actually taking this out to about 17 years. They think that it's going to be looking at as still being viable in that time frame. The value of the robot after its useful life, so per robot we put in about $35,000. And I know when we talk about this figure here, is it going to be $50,000? Is it going to be down to $20,000? We don't have enough research right now to actually see what, but we do have some of these robots. If you're looking for, I use the example of the Lely, the A3, where we've got other producers that have the A3s, and they want to expand and they want to keep the same type of robot. So maybe that A3 is going to be pretty valuable to somebody else, but it really depends if you got to have a demand for it. The interest rate on money at 5.5%, the insurance rate to make sure we're insuring these. We've already had one in Wisconsin that burned down from my understanding. And so we definitely want to make sure we're insuring that. The increased value of these 3 robots at $750,000. When we take a look at repair and supply, I'm going to pull this one out here because this is what the survey says, is that about $7,500 on average. This is what the milk supplies and the teat dip are over and above that. When we take a look at teat dip before and teat dip after, when you not a big range there, but we've had some producers that were doing a very good job with teat dip before a robot, and after robot, they would tend to say that it's close to $1,000 per robot per year. But again, depends on what kind of a system you had before and what you're going to after. One of the frustrations, I think, milk quality wise, is the ability of these robots to do a very good job with teat dipping. So it's kind of a concern. Current hours of milking labor in our system, again, depends on what system we're coming to, but we had estimated 14 hours per day to milk these 216 cows beforehand. Hours of milking labor, 5.3, so at 1.25 or so per robot tends to be pretty good, including fetch cows and things like that. Heat detection will tend to go down based on rumination data and motion data. That heat detection needs and labor tends to go down. Labor rate, again, the higher the labor cost, and if you're looking at labor getting going exponential into the future, or $18, $20, $25 an hour in the next 10, 15 years, which is probably going to go to just with inflation, is that line item and the time value of money towards that will actually increase your propensity to consider the robot. Records management tends to actually go up. Again, the 100 data points that you're getting from the robot itself. Labor management would tend to go down, and this is actually kind of a labor management type dollar value for the owner that might be managing the labor. When we take a look at variables that tend to have a higher propensity to change the outcome, so their sensitivity is higher, is going to be this pounds of milk. So again, when we take a look at 3 to 5% is almost a given in a retrofit. If you're going into a new facility, that's 6 to 8% tied onto that. So 10 to 12% not out of the ordinary, but again, realize that 6 to 8% should just go to the facility, not to the robot. But again, with our new ones in Iowa, the average was closer to 17%, which tends to be higher than what most research around the country and around the world would say the robots will give. So this is your projected milk change. We already talked about somatic cell count going down. There's also some information you're going to get from the robot that tends to have a lot of data points to it. Is it going to show up in milk production? Hopefully over time it would. But sometimes producers like to give a little just because of all the information that they have with the robot. Nutrition-wise, when we take a look at, the easiest thing I can say here is that when we take a look at some herds that are milked both with a parlor and a robot, the cost difference in those rations was only about 1/2 cent per pound of dry matter with that. So not probably as dramatic as what people might think it would be. When you take a look at culling, tends to go down a little bit. Reasons for culling will change. When you take a look at chemical costs and things like that. So each one of these boxes are a variable that you as a producer can actually put into it to kind of see how that variable might change the outcome with it. So once we have all those variables into it, now we've got this partial budget. My positive impacts, which are increased incomes and decreased expenses in the way of milk production, milk premiums. Cull cow sales went down. It's negative because our cull rate went down. The software value, reduced heat detection, reduced labor management. So total positive impacts of $174,000 in this example. The negative side on the right side here, the increased expenses is this capital recovery cost of the robots. And so that's depreciation and interest off this robot, the repair and insurance, the increased feed cost. And I put that one in yellow because a lot of times people talk about this increased milk production and they forget how much of that increased milk production actually goes back out in increased feed costs. Cow replacement cost, utilities, supplies, record management, so total increased expenses. When we take a look at the decreased incomes, we couldn't think of any. Total negative impacts, 172 versus 174. So we have a net financial impact of this of actually a positive 1472 for these robots. And then the producers would tend to say about $15,000 added to the quality of life for our family, just managing the farm. So that actually I put that into that, even though we don't put that into financial terms or whatever. But in this situation, the robot is actually more profitable than the system we're comparing it to. So when we take a look at the profitability of it, it's very different than the cash flow part of it. And so if we're going to take a look at, let's just look at this cash flow, because when you take a look at cash flow, is that you're going to, on the profit side, you're going to depreciate and also have an interest charge, and you spread that out over 15 years. But the bank might make you pay it back in 7 years. So in effect, cash flow wise early on, you're going to be buying your labor for the next 15 years, but the bank's going to make you pay it in 7. So that tends to create a little bit of a cash flow problem. But then after 7 years, after it's paid off, hopefully, then you should have a kind of a cash flow, very positive thing, because you don't have that principal and interest payment on that anymore. So let's look at a loan that's 7 years, $675,000. So we down paid a little bit on this, but we still have this much to pay. So our total payment that first year is $116,000. But we need to compare this to, there's $116,000, which is on the profit side. But the capital recovery charge was $84,000, but we need to pay back $116,000 a year. So we actually have a negative cash flow drain of $32,000 on this cash flow part of it. So we're going to save some heat detection. Say the milking labor and heat detection labor was $46,000. The amount hired to that was $35,000. I was putting in the rest of that. I wasn't paying myself. So now we have to actually pay it because we've got this robot and it has a bank loan that needs to be paid cash. And so now we have another $11,501 of cash flow drain on top of this. So the total change in cash flow is a negative $42,000. So by the time we take a look at this profit wise, it was positive. Looking at the cash flow, which because of that having to pay this thing back in 7 years, it actually becomes quite negative. So when people ask, do they pay, it really depends on how you're trying to look at it. So we'll take a break here, Mike, and go at it.
Well, here we go. Well, I think this will be a fast vote here. Get ready to vote quickly, all you Democrats, Republicans. If a robot is profitable, then will it cash flow? If a robot is profitable, then it will cash flow. Is that true or false? I think I got my answer. Abby, did you vote on this one?
I don't know. I'm going to guess false because I think you can be profitable but still not necessarily cash flowing. But what do you think, Mike?
Well, I think I'm voting with you as well, if I understood what Larry was saying here just a minute or so ago. But we've got about 2/3 of the vote in here, so let's go ahead and show it. And Larry, any surprises here?
Well, this might have been a little bit of a trick question too. So 24% said it was true, 76% said it was false. So when you take a look at it, will it cash flow? It could, but it might not. Will it not cash flow? We don't know that either. So I should have put a third line in there that's kind of said it really depends on a few factors there. But so when we take a look at the next part with paybacks, again, low-cost milking parlors, when you take a look at paybacks of 1 to 5 years, but it really depends if you're in these efficiency factors here. 5 to 10 year paybacks tend to be, some of these might be in 15 years. If I've got that milk production down to 3,000 pounds, it might be a 15-year payback. And if it's going to wear out after 15 years and you've got a 16-year payback, we could get ourselves into some financial problems with that as well. So that these paybacks are all over the board is the bottom line. But the paybacks on low-cost milking parlors are all over the board as well, more so dependent on this efficiency factor and this efficiency factor with both the low-cost parlors and the robots. When we take a look at payback periods of when we did in 2012, we were looking at 6.1 years just on the labor savings, increased milk production, a 15-year useful life, which we would tend to say we should be getting that with labor savings, increased milk production, and other revenue. I'm actually getting closer to that 5 to 6 years. So the bottom line is if these robots are well managed, they can have some pretty decent payback periods in and of themselves. So bottom line is we get into the summary here, again, just as a question, it's labor availability, it's labor flexibility, it's the cost of labor. All those issues that go into labor is definitely one of the more important reasons, if not the main reason. So studies have shown that robotic milking systems tend to be less profitable than parlors or other milking systems. But again, this is so dependent on so many variables that sometimes it's hard for us to actually make this statement. But in general, they tend to be more expensive. But I would also say that as we learn to manage these robots better and better, okay, this discussion could actually change here in the next few years as well. Some of the variables in the milk production, this 9 to 12% In Iowa here, the 10%, with the remodel 17% again. So those are some very real milk production changes that we've experienced. And again, I would say that we've had some in that 20 to 25%. So again, 5 pounds if you remodel, 10 pounds with new construction. When you take a look at 3 to 5% gain to the robot, 6 to 8% gain to the new construction of the freestall. So let's just kind of keep those in mind as we take a look at it. So labor wages, the labor savings, the labor efficiency. Again, how do you magnify this labor to start getting into that 2.2 million? And maybe someday we'll see somebody actually attain 3.2 million pounds of milk per FTE in a certain type of a system. The years of useful life, again, that whole concept of how long these robots are going to last are going to be an issue. And as we get more and more experience with them, and as the build, we might get more years out of them. The repairs, undoubtedly the biggest frustration. But again, number 7 there, just magnifying the labor efficiency with them. And I think number 8 is just one that we hear all the time, is that cows tend to like them. And you hear the producers talk about how calm their cows are, and just a totally different situation with their cows and the robot versus having them in the holding area, milking them by themselves and things like that. So we tend to say that cows tend to like them and people tend to like them as well. So your turn, Mike.
Well, here's our last poll question. So those of you that got them wrong, here's your last chance. Producers tend to agree that robots are, 1, a good financial investment, 2, a good personal investment, number 3, a good overall investment, or 4, all the above. And boy, Abby, this is going to be a fun one on here. And the polls are open. Where are you going to go, ma'am?
I'm going to go with that 4th choice, all of the above.
All of the above. I'll live on the cutting edge. I'm going to go a good personal investment. That's where I'm going to check my box there, but we'll see at this point. Abby, you've been pretty hot on the polls here, and we've got 75% in, so let's share it with Larry. It's kind of the take-home message. Larry, what do you think?
Okay, so only 1% said the good financial investment. I was a little surprised at that, but 35%, when you take a look at the personal investment, I think when you over 30 of you had said that, and I think a good reason why that would be the correct answer is just because even though sometimes it might not make the most financial sense, there's so much quality of life type things and other types of things and people that just like to work with technology on and kind of a personal reasons for it, that I think that's a good answer. A good overall investment to add those two things together, and then 51% said all the above, and I would definitely agree with that all these above could be some very good reasons to do that. And again, remember that we did not survey the ones that no longer use the robotic milking system, that we're not happy with it or whatever. So I think those are some pretty good answers as we take a look at that people do find that these people do like them for those reasons.
So that's it. We have summarized it very nicely. Abby, we'll let you do some housekeeping things here before we go to the Q&A.
Very good. Thank you, Mike. Thank you to Larry for that great presentation. I think you covered a lot of ground talking both about the dairy producer perspectives and the financial side of robotic milking. It's definitely a hot topic right now, and there are people thinking about it and installing that automatic milking system. So thanks for giving us some insight on what you have learned working with producers in your part of the country. I'd like to also thank Cargill Animal Nutrition once more for sponsoring this session. If you would like to view this webinar again, or any of our previous webinars from the past number of years, you could always visit our archives anytime at hoards.com/webinars. And there you will find the whole listing of all the webinars that we've done since we began this series in 2011. For those of you that are listening today, you will also receive a 7-question email survey later in the week. We hope that you'll take a few minutes to fill that out, because we appreciate hearing what you thought of the presentation, of the webinars in general, and if you have any recommendations for the future. Talking about the future, if you look at the screen, you'll see 2 of our upcoming webinars listed. Next month, in December, we'll have Bill Weiss from The Ohio State University. This will be a feeding-related webinar, and it is titled Cutting Feed Costs Without Cutting Milk. So very important right now with the low milk prices that we were talking about before the presentation. How can we cut costs without lowering our milk production? So we'll see what Dr. Weiss has to say about that next month on the 10th. Then looking forward to 2019, which is really hard to believe that we're already looking into the next year. But we are going to kick off 2019 with a dairy situation and outlook presentation that will be given by Mark Stevenson from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So he will kick off the year talking about where we kind of sit in the dairy industry and what is going to happen for the upcoming year. Hopefully he'll have some positive things to share at that point. So please join us for those presentations. The December webinar, I do want to point out that it will be sponsored by QLF Quality Liquid Feeds based out of Wisconsin. Mike, I think a few questions may have come in during the presentation. If you would share those with Larry now, it'd be great to get a few minutes for him to answer some of those questions.
Right. Oh, we got a whole bunch, Larry. So you're on the clock, as we would say. Well, we encourage questions to come in ahead of the webinar, and you're going to see several of them pop up here. So here, we'll do those first. First question for you, Larry. Is there enough market data to estimate the economic life of a robot and how much it depreciate in value over time? Is there a resale value for the robotic equipment? You may have covered that, but you may want to summarize that quickly.
I think just real quickly is that it's still pretty new for the ones that are being resold. So yeah, some are having success selling them, and for what price. We've had some that had very low prices even just a few years ago. So I would tend to say we don't have enough for them to actually get some kind of an assurance that 10 years down the road or 15 years down the road, my robot's going to be worth this, just because there just haven't been that many that have been resold.
Another question is, how does the cost of hired human labor compare to the cost of the robot? Does this depend on how often the robots are replaced?
Well, if we take just a look at the hired cost, if you remember some of those graphs, I guess I would kind of go back to them. So when you take a look at replacing, like in that tie stall barn, the robot's almost replacing almost 100% of that labor because there isn't much in the way of capital cost on there. But when you take a look at the robot, if maybe 5 to 10% of this total cost is in that wrapped up in the robot labor. Everything else is more of the asset. So I think when we try to take a look at that, the robot's being replaced, I would say about every 15 years. But yeah, they're definitely replacing some quite a bit of human labor.
Let's go to the next PowerPoint. Again, Scott had one question here. Is technical support remote, or are there house calls for troubleshooting and repairs?
That's all over the board. I would tend to say that you've got this phone on you, so if something goes wrong with the robot, your cell phone, or so you've got a pecking order, maybe 3 or 4 people are going to get a phone call in a certain order. If there's something wrong, a lot of times it's something pretty simple. A lot of these producers are being very well trained to be able to do a lot of the repairs themselves and actually go into schools and things like that to be able to do that. And the further you are away from your dealer, the more important that becomes, because the distance of travel and just all the repair costs can actually get quite hefty if you're a long ways away from the dealer. And so they will still make house calls. You know, sometimes when these robots are down for even 2 hours, that's a major event in a lot of herds, just to be able to have if the robots are down that long. So they definitely need to have some pretty good maintenance, and it's got to be very timely maintenance. When things go down wrong, things got to get repaired.
Let's go to the next PowerPoint. Here's one more question from Scott. Last one. Is there a break-even determination as to the size of the dairy or the number of cows needed to support purchasing robots for milking?
I would say about 3 to 5 years ago, I would say it was more of a smaller farm technology. As we get more experience with this, I think it's going into some larger farm technology as well. And I'm not even talking into the robotic robots, but just the single boxes into the larger farms are definitely getting to be a picture for people that are pushing the pencil quite well. And I think I remember sharing that example of the one that actually had some very low costs with their current milking system that have gone to the robots as well. And so I think this is a technology that, yeah, maybe early on it was a lot of smaller farms, but I can see this going into the larger farms as well, especially as labor becomes more and more of an issue.
Okay, one more power question came in, and it's a bit long there, and we noticed that at some robot dairies, everything seems to click and love it. Others struggle with aspects of robotics, including such things as fetch cow, milk quality, robotic operation. Have you been able to identify factors that contribute to farmers achieving the benefits of a robotic lifestyle? That's an interesting question, Larry.
Yeah, so I would tend to say farmers that are more adept at technology and had a very good handle on production management beforehand tend to have some very high levels of success with maybe not even so much milk production increase, but really getting a hold of the nutrition part of it and just other aspects of that. But yeah, you tend to need to like to have like technology And again, if you tend to do a very good job managing a non-robotic herd, you'll probably do a pretty darn good job managing a robotic herd.
Okay, now we'll switch to the questions that came in from our listeners. Here's the first one. What is the experience of the quality of teat prep on robots? Could you elaborate on your comments? You raised a concern about the quality of teat dipping applications.
Yeah, so when we take a look at farms that we called on to with milk quality problems, the biggest thing I'll tend to do is actually just go there and just sit there and watch the teat dipper. And so a lot of times when people are surveyed, they'll tend to say that they feel like the robots are doing a very good job dipping teats. And when we take a look at the some of the problems that they have with them is that when I look at them, sometimes 2 teats are getting dipped, sometimes 3, and in a very few cases, all 4 are actually getting dipped. And so the teat dippers are getting a little bit better. And I think as we take a look at Department of Eggs and things like that, their biggest concern is the milk quality and just the ability of these teats to get dipped and that aspect of it. So I tend to say right now it tends to be a little bit of a problem with robotic milking system, just the ability of these teats to properly get dipped. And it's kind of a little bit of an art as well as a science trying to get that fixed.
Now, here's a couple of easy questions for you, Larry. And the example you did in your calculations with the robot, was that 77 pounds? Did you use the 77 pounds milk in the budget, assuming the 7-pound milk increase?
Yeah, so it's a 10% milk increase. So I tend to feel pretty comfortable with that if people are building new facilities with that. So, yeah.
Another quick question. What's the target number of milkings per day? What would you like to see? One of our listeners want to know. Do you have a guide on that?
Yeah, so I would say a lot of them are like a benchmark would be 180. So that's 60 cows milking around 3 times a day would be close to 180. So if they're getting in 180, they're probably doing a pretty darn good job.
Are most of them going to get 3 times a day or 2.8 or what is that typical number?
2.8 to 3.2. It really depends on stage of lactation and actually the stage of lactation of the whole herd or what they might be working with that. But I think a good target is a minimum of 4,500 pounds. And we've got some producers that are, pushing that 600 or 6,000 pounds per robot per day. And we've actually got a few test sites and other ones that are actually getting a little bit higher than that. So I think the more we learn to manage these robots, the more they're going to be able to pay because we're getting more milk out of the robot.
The last quick question, and that is fetch cows. What is your criteria? What % of the cows should be fetched or would be considered too many or optimal?
Even 1, I think, is too many, but you're definitely going to get them. So whether they're guided systems or free flow systems, you'll tend to get more in the free flow systems. That ration tends to be a big part of that. So if there's too much energy in the TMR, you'll tend to get less visits and more fetch cows. Later lactation cows tend to be more fetch cows. But when we start taking a look at on a per robot basis, if you're starting to catch, fetch more than 3 or 4 per robot, I mean, that's a lot.
Okay. Let's go back, Jim, dialing me down here. What about antibiotic residue? Cows that have been treated are going to come through the robot. And what happens about residue concerns and violations with robots?
Okay, so before any cow would be treated, like I said, before they get treated, that computer is utilized and they actually make sure that cow does not have a chance to get into that robot before we get the computer changed. That robot, that milk's going to be discarded.
So the robot automatically will catch those cows and discard that milk automatically?
Correct.
Okay, another quick question there. Producer says, how long does it take to get the milk increase of that 10% or that 7 pounds?
I would tend to say within the first 3 to 6 months, we'll tend to see a lot of that increase right away.
Here's a naughty question for you. Did you find any relationship with sharing the feed trough and spreading of disease such as bovine tuberculosis? If your answer is yes, what would you advise to manage this potential problem or risk?
I've never seen that, so not being a vet or a nutritionist, I probably want to defer that to somebody that knew more about it than I would.
We've got two comments here that maybe you want to listen to. I'll read them to our listeners. We've been milking with Lely robots for 3 years. And from our experience, I'd say Larry is right on the money, believe it or not. Cows are averaging 36 liters, so it sounds like he may be a Canadian at this point with somatic cell count below 100,000. All good as far as that goes. We've been in sand, love it, but hard on the robots. Any comments on that? This person says it's been good for them. Any comments about sand bedding in the robot?
Yeah, so what we tend to find is automatic scrapers, sand bedding. I think that's been a recipe of why we're seeing such the milk production increase, but it doesn't come without cost to it. In addition to the additional wear and tear on the equipment. So whether you're in a stall barn, even without the robots, we tend to see a little bit of that issue with sand and even more cost, trying to get rid of the sand with it. So definitely a point well taken that we do have issues with it, but we tend to find that the cow comfort and the benefits outweigh the cost of additional repairs and things like that.
Okay, here's kind of another comment. Interesting. Humans can do other farm activities robots can't do. For that reason, I don't think it's a good investment. So they're simply saying robots can't scrape alleys and can't do other things on the farm. Your comments to that comment, which is on the other side of the coin.
Well, actually, the robots can scrape alleys. I spent a lot of time in Europe seeing some of the ones that scrape, and we've got some of those in the States. They can actually push up feed as well. So I would tend to say that these robots are doing a pretty darn good job doing some of those tasks. But yeah, there's definitely some things that we humans can do that robots can't.
Yep. Here's another interesting one. Does the robot check for milk quality before the milk is sent to the big tank? Is there a way to have the robot to determine this is high somatic cell test milk or whatever the case is?
Yeah, so there's the mechanism within the robot can actually tell, and it's not really testing somatic cell count, but it gives them a sense for the milk quality with it. But the producer would actually have to go into the computer, from my understanding, and actually say that we don't want this quarter into the tank. So the use of CMT paddles, DHI, I think is still pretty pertinent to the robotic use, and not just relying on the robot to help us figure with milk conductivity and things like that. So I think the DHI still has a pretty good use for it.
Another interesting one, can you comment on idle time? And I interpret that as meaning the machine is not milking cows. Is there much of that, or is there a guideline of how much idle time when the machine is not physically milking cows?
Yeah, so there is a guideline on it, exactly what it is. I'm not exactly sure. But yeah, so when you take a look at these robots, we have found that sometimes people can actually get more milk out of the robots with like even fewer cows or fewer milkings. And so there's a lot of kind of an art in addition to the science of these robots to just try to figure out how to best utilize that robot on each individual farm.
Here's your final question. You'll be all wore out when this is done. What are your thoughts on feeding things other than pelleted feed mixes? You already made a brief comment on that. For example, ground or rolled grains, a pelleted corn gluten, pelleted DDGs, pelleted soy hulls, and we are aware of some interest of putting liquid feed into the spraying right into the trough. Any comments on that?
Okay, so again, qualifying myself as not a nutritionist, but more of an economist. But from what I'm hearing as we work with these producers is that the pellet tends to be the mainstay with it. But here in Iowa, especially Northeast Iowa, we've got at least more than a few producers that have gone away from the pellet because of the cost of pelleting the feed, and have actually, at least a couple of them are reporting they're really not seeing any difference with it. But you got to really manage what feed's going into them. So when cows come into here, so yeah, the pellet's kind of like a candy for them, and that's the reason that they come into it. When you start taking a look at, maybe just as an example, in the wintertime, as cow's breath and things are freezing outside and things start getting a little mushy, kind of gummed up and things like that, simple things like that can kind of inhibit the amount of feed that a cow can actually intake. And so the more you pellet it, the more it's a strong pellet. I would tend to say we're going to have this tendency to have a better feed intake from the robot. And as we go away from that, non-pelleting and just other things that go on it, possibly gumming up with feeds and things like that, can actually kind of downplay that or put that down a little bit. And so I think it's just really important how well you can manage whatever you try to put into there.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add to it, Larry, that I think you'd want to be looking more like a calf starter, kind of rolled feeds. If it's dusty or fines, you and I both know what's going to happen, and and all those things you already mentioned are going to come into play. So I guess we'll see more new technology and people trying things to see what may or may not work as far as that goes. Well, I think with that, we've just got this great comment, Larry, and I don't know, you're going to get a big head. It says, thanks for a great webinar, and congratulations for Larry for a brilliant presentation. So with that, Abby, we'll turn it back to you to wind up the webinar.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you to the audience for submitting a great group of questions. And Larry, I know it's how hard to answer them all on the fly that quickly, but you did an awesome job with that. So thank you. One more time, I'd like to recognize Cargill Animal Nutrition as our partner for this webinar. We surely appreciate their support. If you want to learn more about the company, please give their website a visit. You can find them online. We would also like to thank you all out there in the audience for tuning in to this presentation by Larry Tranel. He had a lot of good information to share about automatic milking, and we hope that you found it valuable and a great use of your time. We'll get together again next month on December 10th at noon Central Time to talk about cutting feed costs, and we hope that you'll make plans to join us for that presentation as well. Until then, I'd like to thank you all from the group of us here at Hoards Dairyman and the University of Illinois. It's always a pleasure to be able to host these webinars, and we appreciate you spending the time with us learning about different areas of the dairy industry. So until next time, thank you, and we'll look forward to having you joining us again someday.